The alarm in my ear chip screamed a warning half a second before the floor beneath me cracked with heat. I pressed myself against the cold metal wall of the human outpost, my breath caught behind my teeth, my heart pounding so hard I feared it would give me away. I was not supposed to be here. I was not supposed to feel fear like this. I was Kyra Velashan, daughter of the Velashan bloodline, heir to a throne that ruled over 100 worlds, and I was hiding in the shadows of a species my people called weak. The human base sat on a frozen moon, at the edge of a system my father's scouts had marked for future conquest. My mission was simple, or so I had been told. Observe the species called human, record their behavior, return with proof of their inferiority so that the Council of Elders would finally stop whispering that I was too soft to inherit the throne. I had trained for this moment my whole life. I had studied their history from orbit, watched their ships struggle to cross distances my people crossed in a blink, listened to translated fragments of their language that sounded clumsy and rushed compared to the smooth tones of my own tongue. I expected to find fear. I expected chaos. I expected a species clinging to survival with trembling hands. What I found instead was a man standing in the center of a collapsing engine room, calmly wrapping a cable around his wrist, while red warning lights spun above his head like dying stars. His name, I would later learn, was Ethan Brooks. But in that first moment, he was nothing more than a shape in the dark, a silhouette against sparking wires, moving with a steadiness that made no sense to me. The ceiling groaned. A support beam gave way somewhere above him, sending a shower of metal fragments crashing down just a few steps from where he stood. He did not scream. He did not run. He glanced up at the falling debris, sidestepped it without breaking his rhythm, and kept working. I had read reports calling humans emotionally unstable, prone to panic, ruled by irrational impulses. I had believed those reports the way I believed the sun would rise over my homeworld every morning, without question, without doubt. But the man in front of me, the one they called Ethan, moved like someone who had made peace with the fact that this moment might be his last, and had decided that peace was more useful than terror. I pressed my scanner against my chest, the device hidden beneath a cloak, spun from light-bending fiber, technology far beyond anything the humans possessed. It should have made me invisible. It should have made me safe. And yet, crouched in that shadowed corner, I felt more exposed than I had ever felt on any diplomatic stage in my father's court. The engine let out a final shuddering groan, and then, impossibly, steadied. The red lights blinked to a calm blue. The heat radiating from the walls began to fade. Ethan Brooks let out a breath, wiped a streak of oil from his forehead with the back of his hand, and laughed. He actually laughed, a short, tired sound, as if the entire ordeal had been nothing more than an inconvenience. Cutting it close again, he muttered to no one, to himself, to the empty room. Then he turned toward the exit, and for one terrifying heartbeat, his eyes swept directly across the shadow where I stood. I did not move. I did not breathe. My cloak bent the light around me perfectly, or so my engineers had promised. He should not have been able to see anything but empty wall, but something in the way his gaze lingered told me that some part of him, some instinct honed by a life lived on the edge of disaster, had sensed that he was not alone. He did not raise an alarm. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply tilted his head, as if listening to a sound only he could hear, then shrugged and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my racing pulse and a question I had not expected to carry back to my ship that night. Why had he not been afraid? I retreated through the maintenance shaft I had used to enter the base, my hands trembling slightly as I climbed. It was strange, feeling my own body betray a reaction I had trained for years to suppress. Fear was supposed to be beneath me. Fear was for lesser creatures, for prey animals, for beings without the discipline of centuries of training. And yet here I was, shaking after watching a human calmly fix a machine that had nearly killed him. Back aboard my scout vessel, hidden within the icy rings of the outer moon, I sat at my console and stared at the recording I had captured. I replayed it 3 times. Each time, I searched for the panic I had been told to expect, the desperation, the flaw that would prove my father's counsel correct. Each time, I found only a man doing his job, treating near death as an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. My tutor's voice echoed in my memory, cold and certain. Humans are ruled by their emotions, princess. They are quick to fear, quick to despair, quick to fall apart when faced with true danger. This is why the Dominion will conquer them within a single generation, and why you must never doubt the natural order of things. I stared at the frozen image of Ethan Brooks, laughing in the face of disaster, and for the first time in my life, I doubted. I told myself it meant nothing. One human, one moment, was not enough to judge an entire species. My father's advisors would say I was seeing an exception, a single anomaly among countless failures. I needed more data. I needed to watch longer, to see the fear I had been promised eventually surface, to prove that this had simply been a lucky performance from a creature who did not understand how close he had come to dying. So I returned the next night. I told myself it was duty. I told myself it was the mission. I ignored the small, quiet voice inside me that whispered it might be something else entirely, something closer to curiosity, or perhaps even something dangerously close to respect. The outpost was smaller than I expected for a species my people considered a growing threat. A cluster of interconnected domes rose from the frozen ground, lit by warm yellow light that seemed almost defiant against the harsh blue darkness of the moon's endless night. Through a reinforced window, I watched a group of humans gathered around a table, sharing food, laughing at something one of them had said. There was a woman with short dark hair, gesturing wildly as she told a story. There was an older man, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. And there, at the edge of the group, sat Ethan Brooks, quieter than the others, watching everyone with the same careful attention I had watched him with the night before. I settled into the shadow of a supply crate outside the window, my cloak wrapped tight around me, and I watched. This was supposed to be simple reconnaissance, record their patterns, identify weaknesses, return home with proof that would silence the doubts about my worthiness to rule. Instead, I found myself drawn into the rhythm of their conversation, even though I could barely understand half of it. The woman with dark hair, whose name I would later learn was Maya Ford, made a joke about the outpost's failing heating system, and the whole table erupted into laughter, even the older man who had seemed so serious moments before. I did not understand why laughter mattered to my mission, but I found myself leaning closer to the window anyway, straining to catch every word. Hours passed. The gathering slowly dispersed as humans peeled away to their sleeping quarters, until only Ethan remained, sitting alone at the table, staring at a small photograph he had pulled from his jacket pocket. I could not see clearly what the image showed, but something about the way his shoulders dropped, the way his expression softened into something quiet and sad, told me it mattered to him more than anything else in that room. He was not performing for an audience now. There was no one left to impress, no reason to maintain the calm composure I had watched him hold during the engine room collapse. And yet, even alone, even in what should have been his most vulnerable moment, he did not fall apart. He simply sat with his sadness, let it exist without fighting it, and then folded the photograph carefully back into his pocket before standing and turning off the lights. I realized, with a strange tightening in my chest, that I had been holding my breath the entire time. Something about this species refused to fit into the neat boxes my tutors had built for them. They spoke of humans as creatures ruled entirely by fear and impulse, and yet here was a man who faced death without flinching and carried grief without collapsing beneath its weight. I did not know what to make of this contradiction, but I knew I could not stop watching. I returned to my ship that night with more questions than answers, and for the first time since beginning this mission, I found myself dreading the moment I would have to return home and report what I had seen. Because I was no longer certain what story my data actually told. 3 nights passed in this same rhythm. I would slip into the shadows near the outpost, watch the humans go about their strange and unpredictable lives, and retreat before dawn broke across the icy horizon. I watched them repair failing equipment with tools that seemed almost primitive compared to my own technology, yet somehow always found a way to make the impossible work. I watched them argue over small things, laugh over smaller things, and comfort one another during moments that would have broken lesser spirits entirely. On the fourth night, I made a mistake that would change everything. I had grown too comfortable, too confident in my invisibility. I had begun to believe that my cloak made me untouchable, that I could observe forever without consequence. I positioned myself closer to the outpost than I ever had before, eager to catch a clearer view of a conversation happening near the main entrance. My foot caught against a loose piece of scaffolding hidden beneath a thin layer of frost, and the metal groaned loudly beneath my weight. Every human head in the nearby corridor turned toward the sound. My heart slammed against my ribs. I froze, pressing myself flat against the cold metal wall, praying to whatever ancestors watched over my bloodline that the cloak would hold, that the darkness would swallow me whole before anyone could investigate the noise. Footsteps approached, slow, deliberate, unafraid. I recognized the rhythm of that walk before I saw the face attached to it. Ethan Brooks rounded the corner, a small handheld light casting a pale glow across the frozen ground. He stopped just a few steps away from where I stood, close enough that I could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, close enough that I could hear the quiet, steady sound of his breathing. He was looking directly at the empty space where I stood. For a long, terrifying moment, neither of us moved. I told myself he could not see me. I told myself the cloak was working exactly as it should, that this was simply coincidence, that he was investigating a noise and would soon give up and return inside. But something in his expression told me otherwise. There was no fear in his eyes, no confusion, only a quiet, patient curiosity, as if he were solving a puzzle he had been waiting a long time to encounter. "You've been out here a few nights now, haven't you?" he said, his voice calm, almost gentle, directed at the empty air where I hid. I did not answer. I could not answer. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to disappear back into the darkness before this moment could unravel everything I had built my identity around. And yet some other, quieter part of me, the part that had watched him laugh in the face of disaster and grieve in the silence of an empty room, kept me rooted in place. "I'm not going to hurt you," he continued, taking a slow step closer, his hands raised slightly, palms open, in a gesture that even across the vast distance between our two species somehow translated as harmless. "Whatever you are, whoever you are, you don't have to hide." My breath caught in my throat. I had come to this frozen moon expecting to prove that humans were fragile, fearful, beneath the dignity of my people's attention. I had not expected to be the one standing frozen in fear, discovered by a creature who somehow radiated more calm in this uncertain moment than I had felt in my entire life. I did not know, in that moment, what would happen next. I did not know that the choice I was about to make, whether to reveal myself or vanish forever into the night, would set into motion events that would challenge everything I believed about my people, about his, and about the true meaning of strength. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that I could not simply walk away, not anymore, not after everything I had seen. Slowly, with hands that trembled more than I wanted to admit, I reached up and lowered the hood of my cloak, letting the pale light from his handheld device fall across features that no human had ever seen before. His eyes widened, not with terror, but with something closer to wonder. "Well?" he said softly, a small, disbelieving smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I wasn't expecting that. Neither, I realized, staring back at him with my heart pounding in my chest, had I. He did not call for guards. He did not reach for a weapon or sound an alarm that would bring the rest of his crew rushing out into the frozen night. Instead, he simply studied me for a long moment, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air, and then he did something I had never once considered as a possibility in all my training and preparation for this mission. He smiled. "You must be freezing out here," he said, as if I were nothing more than a traveler who had lost her way, rather than the daughter of an empire that had marked his species for conquest. "Come inside. I'll get you something warm." I stood there, stunned into silence, my mind racing through every scenario my tutors had prepared me for. Capture, interrogation, diplomatic posturing, designed to extract information about my people's intentions. None of the possibilities I had rehearsed included an invitation to share a warm drink. "I am not supposed to be seen," I finally managed to say, my voice quieter than I intended, carrying none of the commanding authority I had spent years cultivating in the courts of my father's palace. "Yeah, well," Ethan said, tucking his hands into the pockets of his thick jacket, "you're seen now. Might as well come somewhere warmer while we figure out what happens next." There was no threat hidden in his tone, no hint of the trap I kept expecting to spring shut around me. I searched his face for deception, for the calculated calm of a predator luring prey into a vulnerable position, and found nothing but genuine, patient curiosity. Against every instinct my training had built into me, I followed him inside. The interior of the outpost was smaller than I expected, filled with the low hum of machinery and the faint smell of something warm cooking somewhere down the corridor. Ethan led me to a small room near the edge of the base, away from the main gathering areas, and gestured for me to sit at a metal table, scarred with years of use. "So," he said, settling into the seat across from me, studying my face with open curiosity rather than fear, "you're not from around here." "No," I admitted, deciding that whatever came next, honesty would serve me better than the elaborate deceptions I had prepared. "I am not." Figured as much. He poured a dark, steaming liquid into a cup and slid it across the table toward me. "Coffee. It's not great, but it's warm." I stared at the cup, uncertain whether accepting it carried some hidden significance in human custom, some binding agreement I did not fully understand. Ethan noticed my hesitation and simply shrugged, taking a sip from his own cup as if to demonstrate that it held no danger. "You don't have to drink it," he said. "I just figured you looked cold." I lifted the cup slowly, the warmth seeping into my fingers, and took a small, cautious sip. The taste was bitter, unfamiliar, nothing like the refined teas served in my father's court, and yet there was something comforting in the simple gesture, something that had nothing to do with the flavor and everything to do with the fact that he had offered it freely, without expectation of anything in return. "My name is Ethan," he said after a moment of silence. "Ethan Brooks. And you are?" I hesitated. Revealing my name felt like handing him a piece of myself I could never take back, a thread that could unravel the careful distance I was supposed to maintain between observer and observed. But something about the quiet sincerity in his voice made the hesitation feel unnecessary. "Kyra," I said finally. "Kyra Velashan." "Kyra," he repeated, testing the shape of my name in his mouth. "That's a nice name." We sat in silence for a moment, the warmth of the drink settling into my chest, the low hum of the outpost's machinery filling the space between us. I found myself studying him, the way I had studied him from the shadows over the past several nights, searching for the fear and instability my tutors had promised, and finding instead a calm, steady presence that unsettled me far more than any hostility could have. "Why did you not call for help?" I finally asked, unable to contain the question any longer. "You found an unknown being hiding outside your base, watching you for days. Any reasonable creature would have raised an alarm." Ethan considered the question for a moment, turning his cup slowly between his hands. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess you didn't feel like a threat. You've been out there for days, right? If you wanted to hurt any of us, you probably could have done it by now. Seemed easier to just talk to you instead." His answer struck something deep within me, something I did not have words for yet. My people had built an entire strategy of conquest around the assumption that fear would drive every human decision, that any encounter with the unknown would trigger panic and irrational aggression. And yet here was a man who had chosen curiosity over fear, conversation over conflict, simply because it seemed like the more sensible path forward. "You are not what I expected," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. "Neither are you," he replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I was told stories about creatures from beyond our system, monsters, invaders, things that would tear our world apart the moment they found us. You don't really match that description." I felt a strange twist in my chest at his words, something between guilt and confusion. He did not know the truth of my mission, the reason I had been sent to observe his people in the first place. He did not know that somewhere far beyond this frozen moon, my father's fleets were already preparing contingencies for the day they would arrive at his world in numbers far greater than anything his people could resist. I said nothing of this. Instead, I asked him about his life, curious despite myself, wanting to understand more about the species that had so thoroughly upended everything I believed to be true. Over the following nights, our meetings became a quiet ritual neither of us spoke about openly. I would return to the shadows outside the outpost, and Ethan would find some excuse to slip away from his duties, meeting me in the small room near the edge of the base where we had first spoken. He told me stories about his home, a world called Earth, filled with oceans and mountains and cities that stretched toward the sky. He spoke of wars fought and eventually ended, of divisions healed through effort rather than conquest, of a species that had clawed its way through countless disasters, not through the absence of fear, but through the refusal to let fear dictate their choices. "We're not fearless," he told me one night, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed loosely over his chest. "Anyone who tells you humans don't feel fear is lying. We feel it plenty. We're just stubborn enough not to let it stop us." I turned this idea over in my mind long after our conversation ended, long after I had returned to my ship and lay awake, staring at the stars beyond my window. My entire life, I had been taught that strength meant the absence of fear, that true power belonged only to those who felt nothing at all in the face of danger. But Ethan's words suggested something entirely different, something my tutors had never once considered. Perhaps strength was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. The more time I spent with him, the more I found myself questioning everything I had been raised to believe. I began to notice contradictions in the reports my father's advisors had compiled about human behavior, contradictions I had never thought to question before meeting Ethan Brooks in person. The report spoke of a species ruled entirely by emotion, incapable of strategic thinking, doomed to collapse the moment true pressure was applied. And yet everything I witnessed at this small outpost told a different story entirely. I watched Maya Ford, the woman with dark hair I had first observed laughing at the gathering table, spend an entire night repairing a damaged communication array with nothing more than salvaged parts and stubborn determination, refusing to give up even as hour after hour passed without success. I watched an older man named Owen Blake comfort a younger crew member through what I later learned was grief over a lost family member back on Earth, offering quiet words of support rather than the cold dismissal my own people reserved for displays of emotion. I watched a woman named Grace Miller organize the outpost's dwindling supplies with careful precision, ensuring that everyone had enough to survive even as resources grew thin, sacrificing her own portions without complaint or hesitation. None of it matched the picture I had been given. None of it matched the narrative that justified my father's plans for conquest. One night, as I sat across from Ethan in our small hidden meeting place, I found myself asking a question I had been avoiding for days. "Why do you trust me?" I asked. "You know nothing about where I come from, nothing about my people or their intentions, and yet you continue to meet with me, to share your stories, your history, as if I were simply another traveler passing through." Ethan considered the question carefully before answering, his expression thoughtful rather than guarded. "I don't know everything about you," he admitted, "but I know enough. I've watched how you talk about your people, about your father, about the expectations placed on you. There's a difference between someone hiding something dangerous and someone hiding something they're scared to admit, even to themselves." His words landed with unsettling accuracy, striking closer to the truth than I had intended to reveal. I had come to this outpost with a mission built on the assumption of human inferiority, and yet somewhere along the way, that mission had transformed into something far more complicated, something that felt dangerously close to friendship. "There are things I have not told you," I admitted quietly, staring down at the cup of coffee cooling in my hands. "Things about why I was truly sent here." Ethan met my gaze steadily, no fear in his eyes, only patient understanding. "I figured there might be," he said. "Whenever you're ready to talk about it, I'll listen. Until then, I'm not going anywhere." I did not tell him everything that night. I was not yet ready to speak the words that would shatter the fragile trust we had built between us, the confession that my father's fleets were already preparing to descend upon his world, that everything I had learned during my time here was meant to serve as ammunition for conquest rather than understanding. But as I made my way back to my ship that night, the stars sharp and cold above the frozen moon, I knew with growing certainty that I could not remain silent forever. The days of simple observation were coming to an end. Somewhere beyond the icy rings of this system, my father's scouts were already reporting their findings, and it would not be long before the Dominion's true intentions arrived at this quiet, unsuspecting outpost. I did not know, as I climbed back into my hidden ship that night, that the choice I would soon be forced to make would test everything I had come to believe about loyalty, about family, and about the true meaning of strength. I only knew that whatever happened next, I could no longer stand in the shadows and watch. 3 nights later, everything changed. I had returned to my ship after another quiet conversation with Ethan, my mind still turning over the things he had told me about his people's history, when the communication console flared to life with an incoming transmission bearing my father's seal. My chest tightened the moment I recognized the pattern of light pulsing across the screen. Direct messages from the Emperor himself were rare, reserved only for matters of the highest importance. I opened the transmission with trembling fingers. My father's face filled the screen, stern and composed as always, his sharp eyes studying me even through the vast distance separating us. Behind him, I could see the command deck of his flagship, officers moving with practiced efficiency, preparing for something far larger than routine patrol. "Kyra," he said, his voice carrying the same commanding weight it always held, even in private conversation. "Your reports have been received and reviewed by the Council." "Father," I answered, forcing my voice to remain steady, despite the sudden pounding of my heart. "I have not yet completed my assessment. I require more time to gather accurate data on the human species." "There is no more time," he replied, and something in his tone sent a cold wave of dread through my body. "The Council has grown impatient. Your brother has already presented compelling arguments in favor of immediate action, citing the vulnerability of this outpost as an ideal testing ground for our forces." My stomach twisted painfully at the mention of my brother, Van, whose ambition for the throne had never been subtle, and whose eagerness to prove himself through conquest had always outweighed any consideration for restraint or understanding. "Father, please," I said, hearing the desperation creeping into my own voice. "The humans are not what our reports suggested. They are resourceful, resilient, far more capable than we anticipated. A hasty attack could result in unnecessary losses on both sides." My father's expression hardened, his patience visibly thinning. "You were sent to gather evidence of their weakness, Kyra, not to develop sympathy for a species destined to fall beneath our authority. Have you forgotten your duty to this family, to this empire?" "I have not forgotten," I said quickly, though even as the words left my mouth, I felt the weight of their dishonesty pressing against my chest. I simply believe caution would serve us better than haste. The fleet departs within 3 days, my father said, his tone leaving no room for further debate. Your brother will lead the initial assault force to establish dominance over the outpost and gauge the true extent of human resistance. You will return to the flagship immediately to prepare for your role in the formal negotiations that will follow their surrender. The transmission ended before I could offer another protest, leaving me alone in the cold silence of my ship, staring at a blank screen while my mind raced through the implications of what I had just been told. 3 days. I had 3 days before an armed force descended upon the outpost, before Ethan and Maya and Owen and Grace and everyone else I had come to know found themselves facing my people's overwhelming military might. I sat frozen at my console for what felt like hours, torn between two loyalties that had once seemed inseparable but now stood in direct opposition to one another. Everything I had been raised to believe told me that my duty belonged to my father, to my empire, to the bloodline that had shaped my entire existence. And yet everything I had witnessed over the past several nights told me that the humans deserved more than the fate my brother intended to deliver. I thought of Ethan's calm composure in the face of near death, his quiet grief over the photograph he carried, his willingness to offer kindness to a stranger who could have easily been a threat. I thought of Maya's stubborn determination, Owen's gentle compassion, Grace's quiet sacrifice. None of these things matched the narrative my people had built to justify conquest. None of it deserved the violence my brother was preparing to unleash. I made my decision before I fully understood the consequences of what I was about to do. That night, I returned to the outpost, moving faster and with less caution than I had ever allowed myself before. I found Ethan in our usual meeting place, and the moment he saw my expression, his easy smile faded into concern. "Kyra," he said, rising from his seat. "What's wrong? I need to tell you everything," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to remain composed. "Everything I should have told you from the beginning." I spoke quickly, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess myself. I told him about my true mission, about the Dominion's plans for conquest, about my father's fleet already preparing to depart, about my brother's eagerness to prove himself through the subjugation of his people. I told him about the reports that painted humans as weak and emotionally unstable, reports that had been proven wrong time and again during my nights of observation. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from shock to something more complicated, something that held both hurt and understanding in equal measure. "You were sent here to spy on us," he said quietly, when I finally finished. "To find our weaknesses so your people could use them against us." "Yes," I admitted, unable to soften the truth any further. "That was my original purpose. But everything I have seen here has changed what I believe. I do not want this attack to happen. I do not want your people to suffer for the ambitions of mine." He was silent for a long moment, studying my face with an intensity that made me want to look away. "Why are you telling me this now? You could have stayed silent. You could have let this happen and returned to your empire with your mission completed." "Because I could not," I said simply. "Because you showed me kindness when you had every reason to fear me. Because I have come to understand that strength is not measured by the absence of fear, but by the choices made despite it. I could not stand by and watch this happen to people who have shown me nothing but decency." Something shifted in his expression then, the hurt giving way to a quiet, steady resolve. 3 days, he said, more to himself than to me. "That's not much time to prepare a defense against a fleet we can't even begin to match." "I know," I said, "but perhaps preparation does not need to mean matching their strength directly. Perhaps there are other ways to resist." Over the following hours, we spoke urgently about what could possibly be done. Ethan called an emergency gathering of the outpost senior staff, and I found myself standing before Maya Ford, Owen Blake, Grace Miller, and several other humans I had only observed from a distance, revealing my true identity and the danger bearing down upon them. The reaction was not what I expected. There was fear, certainly, but it did not manifest as the paralyzing panic my people's reports had promised. Instead, I watched them channel that fear into immediate, focused action. "All right," Maya said, standing at the head of the gathered group, her earlier warmth replaced by sharp, decisive leadership. "We don't have the firepower to fight a fleet head-on, but we know this moon better than they do. We know every tunnel, every weak point in the ice, every place where our systems can be rerouted to buy us time." Owen Blake nodded, already pulling up schematics of the outpost on a nearby display. "If we can disable their initial landing zones, force them to spread their forces thin across multiple entry points, we might be able to slow their advance long enough to get a distress signal out to the nearest Allied colony." "That colony is over 2 days away by conventional travel," Grace pointed out, her expression grim, but not defeated. "We'd need to hold out that entire time." "Then we hold out," Ethan said firmly, his eyes meeting mine across the room. "We've survived worse odds before." I stood among them, watching this remarkable display of resourcefulness unfold in real time, and felt a swelling mixture of pride and guilt tangle together in my chest. Pride, because I was witnessing exactly the kind of resilience I had come to associate with this species over the past several nights. Guilt, because my own people's ambitions had forced this crisis upon them in the first place. "There is something else," I said, stepping forward as the group turned their attention toward me. "My people's technology, while advanced, is not without weakness. Their reliance on centralized command structures means that disrupting communication between vessels can create confusion and delay. I know the frequencies they use, the protocols that govern their formations. I can help you exploit these weaknesses." Ethan studied me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Why would you turn against your own people to help us?" I considered the question carefully before answering, wanting to give him the truth, rather than a simple, easy response. "Because loyalty to blood should not mean blind obedience to cruelty," I said. "Because I have spent my entire life being told what your people are, and I have found that truth to be a lie built to justify conquest. I cannot, in good conscience, remain silent while that lie leads to suffering I could have prevented." Something in my words seemed to settle the lingering doubt in the room, and the group returned to their planning with renewed determination. Over the following 2 days, I watched the humans transform their small, vulnerable outpost into something far more formidable than my people's reports could have ever predicted. Maya led teams rewiring the base's defensive systems, repurposing mining equipment into makeshift barriers capable of slowing an armed advance. Owen worked tirelessly on communication systems, establishing backup channels that would allow them to coordinate even if primary systems failed. Grace organized supply distribution with meticulous efficiency, ensuring that every person on the outpost had what they needed to endure a prolonged confrontation. And Ethan, calm and steady as he had been from the very first night I observed him, moved between every team, offering guidance, encouragement, and the quiet confidence that seemed to hold the entire operation together. I contributed what knowledge I could, sharing details about my people's tactical protocols, their reliance on overwhelming force rather than adaptive strategy, their tendency to underestimate opponents they considered beneath their notice. Every piece of information I offered was met not with blind acceptance, but with careful scrutiny, humans questioning and refining the plans until they felt confident in their approach. I found myself, during these frantic hours of preparation, growing to understand something my father's advisors had never once considered in all their reports and assessments. The strength of humanity did not lie in individual power or technological superiority. It lay in their ability to adapt, to cooperate, to face impossible odds with creativity and stubborn determination rather than despair. On the second night of preparation, as exhaustion began to weigh heavily on everyone involved, I found myself sitting alone with Ethan in a quiet corner of the outpost, watching the frozen landscape stretch out beyond the reinforced windows. "Are you scared?" he asked quietly, breaking the comfortable silence between us. I considered the question honestly before answering. Yes, I admitted. I am afraid of what will happen to you, to Maya, to Owen and Grace, and everyone here who has shown me nothing but kindness. I am afraid of what will happen to me if my father discovers my betrayal. I am afraid that despite everything we have prepared, it will not be enough. But you're still here, he said, still helping, still choosing to stay despite all of that fear. Yes, I said simply. Because I have learned from watching your people that fear does not have to dictate our choices. It is simply something we carry with us while we do what needs to be done. Ethan smiled, a tired but genuine expression that carried none of the resentment or suspicion he might have justifiably held toward me. You've come a long way from the person hiding in the shadows outside our base, he said. So have you, I replied, and found myself smiling back, despite the weight of everything bearing down upon us. From a man who calmly repaired a dying engine to someone organizing an entire defense against an invading fleet. Guess we've both learned a few things, he said quietly. We sat together in silence for a while longer, watching the stars shift slowly overhead, both of us aware that within a single day, everything we had built together over the past several nights would be tested in ways neither of us could fully predict. I did not know, as I finally rose to return to my hidden ship for what little rest I could manage, that the coming confrontation would demand more from both of us than either of us had yet imagined. I only knew that whatever happened next, I would face it standing beside the humans I had once been sent to study, rather than hiding in the shadows, watching from a careful, comfortable distance. The time for observation had ended. The time for choosing a side had finally, irreversibly, arrived. The fleet arrived exactly on schedule, 3 days after my father's transmission, announced by a series of bright flashes that split the dark sky above the frozen moon. I stood beside Ethan at the outpost's primary observation window, watching as my brother's vessels emerged from the folds of space, their sleek, angular hulls catching what little starlight filtered through the darkness. They're bigger than I expected, Maya said quietly from behind us, her voice tight with tension, despite the steady resolve I had come to recognize in her over the past several days. Numbers don't win every fight, Owen replied, though even he could not fully hide the concern flickering behind his eyes as more ships continued to emerge, forming a slow, methodical formation above the moon's surface. I felt my own chest tighten as I recognized the lead vessel, my brother's personal flagship, its distinctive markings unmistakable even from this distance. Van had always possessed an eagerness for confrontation that bordered on recklessness, tempered only by his desire to appear controlled and composed before our father's watchful judgment. I knew, without needing further confirmation, that he would not hesitate to demonstrate overwhelming force the moment he believed the humans posed any resistance at all. They will attempt communication first, I said, turning to address the small group gathered around the console. My people value the appearance of diplomacy, even when the outcome has already been decided. Whatever demands they make, do not comply immediately. Buy us as much time as possible. Grace nodded, moving quickly to prepare the communication array Owen had spent the past 2 days reinforcing. Within moments, a transmission request blinked across the outpost's main screen, the seal of my father's empire displayed prominently across the header. Ethan stepped forward, his expression calm despite the enormity of what was about to unfold. "I'll handle the talking," he said. "You stay back, out of view. If they see you here, helping us, it complicates things in ways we can't predict yet." Reluctantly, I retreated to the shadows near the edge of the room, watching as Ethan accepted the transmission, his posture steady, his voice carrying none of the fear I knew he must be feeling beneath the surface. My brother's face filled the screen, sharp and cold, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the human standing before him. "This outpost belongs to territory claimed under the authority of the Velashan Dominion," Van announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "You will surrender your facility and submit to inspection, or face the consequences of resistance? And if we choose not to surrender? Ethan asked, his tone measured, neither defiant nor submissive, simply curious. Something flickered across my brother's expression, a brief flash of surprise, quickly masked by renewed arrogance. Then you will discover exactly how limited your options truly are, he said. You have 1 hour to comply. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the room in tense silence. Ethan turned to face the gathered group, his expression grim but resolute. 1 hour, he said. Let's make sure we're ready. The following 60 minutes passed in a blur of frantic final preparations. Maya coordinated teams, positioning makeshift barriers at every possible entry point, while Owen ensured backup communication channels remained functional in case primary systems failed under attack. Grace distributed emergency supplies to every corner of the outpost, ensuring that no matter how the confrontation unfolded, everyone would have what they needed to endure. I found myself moving between teams, offering what guidance I could about my people's likely tactics, translating my knowledge of Dominion protocols into strategies the humans could use to their advantage. It was strange, watching my own people's fleet from the perspective of those they intended to conquer, recognizing patterns and weaknesses I had never once considered from within the safety of my father's court. Your brother will send an initial scouting force first, I explained to Maya as she reviewed the outpost's defensive schematics one final time. He will not risk the full fleet until he has confirmed the extent of your resistance. This is your opportunity. If you can repel the initial force convincingly, it may force him to reconsider a full assault, buying additional time for reinforcements to arrive. And if the initial force is enough to overwhelm us anyway? Maya asked, her expression steady despite the weight of the question. Then we adapt, I said simply, echoing sentiments I had absorbed from watching this remarkable species over the past several days. We do not have the luxury of guaranteed outcomes. We only have the choice to do everything within our power, regardless of the odds against us. Maya studied me for a moment, something like respect flickering behind her tired eyes. You've changed a lot since Ethan first told us about you, she said. So have my beliefs about what your people are capable of, I replied honestly. When the hour finally expired, my brother's scouting force descended upon the outpost exactly as I had predicted, a contingent of armored vessels touching down at the base's northern perimeter, disgorging soldiers equipped with weapons far beyond anything I had witnessed in the humans' possession. I watched from the safety of the command room as the confrontation began to unfold across multiple external cameras, my heart pounding with a fear I made no attempt to suppress. The initial exchange was brief but fierce. The humans, rather than meeting the Dominion soldiers head-on, retreated strategically through the tunnels Owen and his team had reinforced over the past 2 days, luring the invading force deeper into a maze of narrow corridors where their superior numbers and weaponry mattered far less than the humans' intimate knowledge of the terrain. They're falling for it, Grace said, watching the tactical display with cautious optimism. They're splitting their formation to pursue us through the tunnels. Exactly as planned, Ethan confirmed, his focus never wavering from the unfolding confrontation. Owen, now. Owen's fingers moved rapidly across his console, triggering a sequence that sealed several key tunnel junctions simultaneously, trapping a significant portion of the Dominion scouting force in a section of the outpost specifically designed to disorient and delay rather than cause lasting harm. I watched with a strange mixture of pride and unease as soldiers who had once been my people found themselves confused and disoriented, their advanced weaponry rendered largely useless against an environment they did not understand. But my brother, watching from his flagship above, was neither foolish nor easily discouraged. Within moments, additional forces began descending toward the outpost's southern perimeter, clearly intent on establishing a second front to compensate for the confusion unfolding in the north. They're adapting faster than expected, I warned, watching the tactical display with growing concern. My brother will not allow a single setback to derail his intentions. He will continue escalating until he either succeeds or exhausts his available forces. Then we keep adapting too, Ethan said firmly, already redirecting teams to reinforce the southern defenses. The confrontation stretched on for hours, each side probing for weaknesses, each side adjusting strategies in response to unexpected developments. I watched the humans demonstrate a level of tactical flexibility that would have shocked my father's advisors, drawing on every available resource, every scrap of knowledge about the terrain, every ounce of stubborn determination to hold their ground against a force that should have overwhelmed them within minutes, according to every report I had ever studied. As the hours wore on, exhaustion began to weigh visibly upon everyone in the command room. Grace's usually steady hands trembled slightly as she coordinated dwindling supplies among the defensive teams. Owen's voice grew hoarse from constant communication with scattered groups throughout the outpost. Maya's sharp, decisive leadership began to show cracks of fatigue, though her resolve never wavered even as the situation grew increasingly dire. "We can't hold the southern perimeter much longer," Owen reported, his expression grim as he studied the tactical display. "They're bringing up reinforcements faster than we can adapt our defenses." I felt a cold dread settling in my chest as I recognized the truth in his assessment. My brother's forces, having learned from their initial setbacks, were now converging with a coordinated precision that threatened to overwhelm the outpost's remaining defenses within the hour. "There may be another option," I said slowly, an idea forming in my mind that filled me with equal parts hope and terror. My father values the appearance of order and legitimate conquest above all else. If I were to reveal myself, to speak directly to my brother and expose the true nature of what he intends to do here, it might create enough hesitation to shift the balance. Ethan turned to face me, concern evident in his expression. "That could put you in serious danger, Kyra. If your own people see you as a traitor—" "I am already a traitor in their eyes," I said, meeting his gaze steadily. "The moment I chose to warn you of this attack, I forfeited any protection my bloodline might have offered. But perhaps my testimony can accomplish something my brother's soldiers cannot. Perhaps it can force the Dominion to confront the truth of what conquest actually means, rather than the sanitized version presented in council chambers far from the reality of the battlefield." A tense silence settled over the room as the gathered humans considered my proposal. Finally, Maya spoke, her voice steady, despite the exhaustion evident in her features. "It's a risk, but at this point, I think we're out of safer options." Ethan studied me for a long moment, something complicated passing behind his eyes. "Are you certain about this?" he asked quietly. "Once you do this, there's no going back to the life you had before." "I have already chosen my path," I said simply. "I chose it the moment I decided to warn you, rather than remain silent and watch your people suffer for the ambitions of mine. Whatever happens next, I would rather face it honestly than continue hiding in the shadows." Ethan nodded slowly, something like respect and worry mixing together in his expression. "Then let's make sure your voice reaches him." Owen worked quickly to establish a direct channel to my brother's flagship, overriding the jamming signals that had disrupted communication throughout the earlier confrontation. As the connection finally stabilized, I stepped forward, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and unshakable resolve, ready to speak words that would forever alter my place within the empire I had once been destined to inherit. The screen flickered to life, revealing my brother's face, streaked with the strain of an unexpectedly difficult confrontation, his eyes widening with shock the moment he recognized my presence among the humans he had come to conquer. "Kyra," he said, disbelief evident in his voice. "What is the meaning of this?" I took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of every choice that had led me to this moment settle firmly upon my shoulders. "The meaning, brother," I said, my voice carrying a strength I had never before felt in his presence, "is that everything we were taught about this species was a lie built to justify exactly what you are attempting to do here. and I will not stand silently by while that lie costs innocent lives. The confrontation that followed would test not only the fragile alliance I had built with the humans, but the very foundations of the empire I had been born to inherit. My brother's expression twisted through a rapid succession of emotions, shock giving way to anger, anger giving way to something colder and more calculating. "You would betray your own bloodline for the sake of these creatures?" he demanded, his voice rising with barely contained fury. "Do you understand what you have done, Kyra? Father will not simply forgive this." "I understand exactly what I have done," I replied, refusing to let my voice waver, despite the fear coiling tightly in my chest. "I have chosen truth over convenient lies. I have chosen to see these people as they actually are, rather than as our reports have conveniently painted them to justify conquest. They are lesser creatures," Van spat, his composure fraying further with each passing moment. "Fragile, emotional, unworthy of the resources and territory they occupy." "Then explain to me," I said, stepping closer to the screen, "how these lesser creatures have held your forces at bay for hours, adapting to every strategy you have attempted, refusing to break, despite facing weapons and numbers that should have overwhelmed them within minutes. Explain to me how fear alone could drive such resourcefulness, such unwavering determination in the face of impossible odds." My brother fell silent for a moment, clearly searching for a response that would restore the certainty he had walked into this confrontation with. Behind him, I could see other officers on his command deck exchanging uncertain glances, clearly unsettled by the unexpected resistance they had encountered. "This changes nothing," Van finally said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "Our orders remain the same. This territory will be claimed, regardless of your misguided sympathies." "Then you will have to explain to Father why his heir stood against you," I said, meeting his gaze steadily through the screen. "You will have to explain why an entire fleet could not subdue a single outpost without unacceptable losses. You will have to explain why the daughter you all dismissed as too soft for the throne understood something about strength that generations of council advisors never once considered." I watched something shift in my brother's expression, uncertainty creeping into features that had always carried unwavering confidence in his own righteousness. Before he could respond, another voice interjected from somewhere off-screen, older and more measured than my brother's increasingly agitated tone. "Enough," the voice commanded, and my heart nearly stopped as my father's face appeared beside my brother's on the screen, his expression unreadable in a way that terrified me far more than open anger would have. "Father," I said, forcing myself to maintain composure despite the sudden overwhelming fear clawing at my chest. "I did not expect you to be monitoring this confrontation personally. I monitor everything that concerns the future of this empire," he replied, his voice carrying the same cold authority I had known my entire life. "Explain yourself, Kyra. Explain why you have chosen to align yourself against your own people." I took a steadying breath, aware that whatever I said next would determine not only my own fate, but potentially the fate of everyone standing behind me in that command room, watching this confrontation unfold with expressions caught between hope and dread. "I was sent to observe this species and report on their weaknesses," I began, choosing my words carefully. "Instead, I discovered a species capable of remarkable resilience, cooperation, and courage. I discovered creatures who face fear, not with paralysis, but with determined action. I discovered that everything our reports claimed about their inferiority was built upon assumptions that crumble the moment they are tested against reality." "And this discovery justifies betraying your bloodline?" my father asked, his tone giving nothing away. "It justifies questioning whether conquest built upon false narratives truly serves the strength and honor of our empire," I replied, holding his gaze despite every instinct urging me to look away. "What honor is there in claiming victory over a species we deliberately misunderstood in order to justify our aggression? What strength is demonstrated by overwhelming force against people who have shown nothing but resourcefulness and resilience in the face of our unprovoked assault? Silence stretched across the transmission, broken only by the faint hum of machinery in both the outpost's command room and my father's distant flagship. I could see Van shifting uncomfortably beside our father, clearly uncertain how to respond to a confrontation that had evolved far beyond his initial expectations. Finally, my father spoke again, his expression still carefully neutral. "You believe this species deserves consideration beyond mere conquest." "I believe they deserve the truth," I said. "I believe our empire's strength should be measured by wisdom and understanding, rather than the willingness to crush anything we do not fully comprehend. I have spent days among these people, Father. I have watched them face death without abandoning composure, grief without abandoning strength, impossible odds without abandoning hope. If this is weakness, then perhaps our definition of strength has been flawed from the very beginning." My father studied me for a long moment through the screen, his expression unreadable, giving no indication of which direction his judgment might fall. Behind him, I noticed several officers exchanging uncertain glances, clearly aware that this confrontation had shifted into territory none of them had anticipated when they departed for what should have been a straightforward conquest. "Bring forward your evidence," my father finally said. "If you truly believe this species deserves reconsideration, prove it. Show me why an empire built on strength should hesitate before claiming what it has every capability of taking." I turned to Ethan, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, watching the confrontation unfold with careful attention. "Will you help me show them?" I asked quietly. Without hesitation, Ethan stepped forward, positioning himself where my father and brother could see him clearly through the transmission. "My name is Ethan Brooks," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I am not a diplomat or a soldier. I am simply an engineer who has spent the past several days defending my home alongside people I care about, using nothing but our own ingenuity and refusal to give up." He gestured toward Maya, Owen, and Grace, each of them stepping forward in turn, standing together as a unified front against an empire that had dismissed them as inferior without ever truly understanding who they were. "We did not choose this confrontation," Ethan continued. "We did not seek conflict with your people, but when faced with an unprovoked attack, we chose to defend what matters to us, using every resource available, adapting to every challenge thrown against us. We are not perfect. We make mistakes. We feel fear, just as any living creature does. But we do not let that fear define our choices. We choose, again and again, to face impossible situations with resourcefulness, rather than despair." My father listened without interruption, his expression slowly shifting from careful neutrality into something more contemplative. "And you believe this justifies your continued resistance against a superior force?" he asked. "I believe it justifies the chance to be understood, rather than conquered based on false assumptions," Ethan replied. "If your empire truly values strength, then perhaps true strength lies in recognizing when a narrative has been wrong, rather than continuing to enforce it, simply because changing course feels uncomfortable." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I found myself holding my breath, uncertain whether my father's carefully composed expression would break toward acceptance or toward renewed aggression. Finally, he turned his attention back toward me, something unreadable flickering behind his sharp, calculating eyes. "You have always shown compassion the council considered a weakness," he said slowly. "I confess, I have wondered many times whether that compassion would ultimately serve you well or lead to your downfall. Perhaps it can serve the empire as well," I said, seizing the opening his words provided. "Perhaps true strength lies not simply in the capacity for conquest, but in the wisdom to recognize when understanding serves us better than domination. These people are not weak, Father. They are simply different from us, and difference does not automatically justify subjugation." My father was quiet for a long moment, studying the gathered humans standing resolutely behind me, studying my own steady, unwavering expression, weighing considerations I could not fully guess at from across the vast distance separating our two vessels. "Withdraw the fleet," he finally said, turning to address officers standing just beyond the edge of the transmission. Van's expression twisted with visible shock and frustration, though he said nothing in open defiance of our father's command. "Father," I said, relief flooding through me even as uncertainty lingered at the edges of my emotions. "Thank you. Do not mistake this for forgiveness, Kyra," he said, his tone regaining some of its usual sharpness. "Your actions today will carry consequences within the council, consequences you will need to face upon your return. But I have ruled this empire long enough to recognize when a narrative requires reconsideration. Perhaps there is wisdom in understanding this species more thoroughly before determining their fate. Perhaps your unconventional methods have revealed something valuable that our previous reports failed to capture." "I understand," I said, bowing my head slightly in acknowledgement of the uncertain path still stretching ahead of me. "This is not the end of our interest in this species," my father continued, his gaze shifting briefly toward Ethan and the others standing behind me. "But perhaps conquest is not the only path toward understanding their potential value to our empire. Perhaps there are other approaches worth exploring, approaches that do not begin with unprovoked aggression." The transmission ended shortly after, leaving the command room in a stunned, disbelieving silence. I turned to face Ethan and the others, exhaustion and relief crashing over me in equal measure as the reality of what had just happened slowly settled into place. "They're really withdrawing?" Grace asked, disbelief evident in her voice, as she watched the tactical display confirm the retreat of Dominion forces from the outpost's perimeter. "They are," I confirmed, allowing myself a small, tired smile. For now, at least. Maya let out a long, shaky breath, the tension of the past several hours finally beginning to release from her shoulders. "I can't believe that actually worked," she said. "Neither can I, honestly," I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty of the confession. Owen shook his head slowly, a disbelieving smile spreading across his tired features. "Remind me never to underestimate the power of a good argument," he said, earning a tired laugh from the rest of the group. Ethan approached me as the others began the slow process of standing down from their defensive positions, his expression carrying a warmth that settled something anxious and uncertain within my chest. "You did it," he said quietly. "You actually changed his mind." "We did it," I corrected gently. "I could not have made that argument without everything you and your people demonstrated over these past several days. Your resilience gave me the evidence I needed to challenge everything I once believed to be true." "What happens now?" he asked. "For you, I mean. Your father mentioned consequences waiting for you back home." I considered the question carefully, aware that my future within the Empire had irrevocably changed the moment I chose to warn Ethan of the coming attack. "I do not know exactly what awaits me," I admitted, "but whatever consequences I face, I do not regret the choice I made. I would rather face uncertainty, having chosen honesty and compassion, than return to a life built upon convenient lies I now know to be false." Ethan studied me for a long moment, something gentle and sincere passing behind his eyes. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you made the right choice, and whatever happens next, you'll always have people here who remember what you did for us." Over the following days, as the outpost slowly returned to its normal rhythms and the immediate danger of invasion faded into memory, I found myself lingering longer than my original mission ever intended. I helped Owen repair the communication systems damaged during the confrontation. I sat with Grace as she carefully redistributed supplies depleted during the crisis. I listened to Maya recount stories of the confrontation with a mixture of exhaustion and pride, already reshaping the harrowing experience into something the outpost's crew would remember as a testament to their collective resilience rather than simply a brush with disaster. And I spent long, quiet evenings with Ethan, continuing conversations that had begun in careful, cautious observation and had grown into something far deeper and more meaningful than either of us had anticipated when I first hid trembling in the shadows outside his base. "What will you tell your council when you return?" he asked me one evening as we sat together watching the frozen landscape stretch beneath a sky finally free of Dominion warships. "The truth," I said simply. "That everything we believed about your species was built upon fear and convenient assumption rather than genuine understanding. That true strength requires the courage to admit when we have been wrong, rather than the stubbornness to continue enforcing a flawed narrative simply because changing course feels uncomfortable." "Think they'll listen?" he asked. "I do not know," I admitted honestly, "but I intend to make certain they at least hear the truth, regardless of whether they choose to accept it immediately." Ethan smiled, reaching over to gently take my hand, a simple human gesture that carried more warmth and reassurance than any formal diplomatic ceremony I had witnessed throughout my entire life within my father's court. "Whatever happens," he said, "I'm glad you were the one hiding in those shadows all those nights ago. I'm glad it was you who found us." I squeezed his hand gently, feeling the weight of everything that had changed since that first fateful night I had watched him calmly repair a dying engine, refusing to succumb to fear even as disaster closed in around him. "So am I," I said quietly, watching the stars shift slowly above the frozen moon that had become, against every expectation, the place where everything I once believed about strength, fear, and the true nature of humanity had been irrevocably transformed. I had come to this outpost expecting to find weakness, expecting to gather evidence that would justify conquest and validate the narratives I had been raised to accept without question. Instead, I had found courage in the face of impossible odds, resilience born not from the absence of fear, but from the refusal to let fear dictate every choice. I had found kindness offered freely to a stranger who could have easily been a threat, and friendship built upon honesty rather than convenient assumption. I had gone into the shadows to watch the human, expecting to confirm everything my empire believed about a species destined for conquest. Instead, I had found something that would forever change the fate of both our worlds.